Washington, D.C. is full of iconic and moving sights, sights that everyone should experience at least once. I urge you to take a look at the Confederate Memorial in Arlington National Cemetery. We will review the history of the Civil War and of the reconciliation after the war. Arlington National Cemetery is the United States' most venerable military resting ground. Walking into Arlington National Cemetery brings you into an ocean of tombstones. These rows of tombstones look much like troops of soldiers ready to march off. Section 16 is the smallest section at Arlington, but there is a memorial that has to be the most remarkable statue in the country commemorating the dead of any war. What makes Section 16 extremely unusual is that Confederate dead are buried there. 482 Confederate soldiers, former enemies, rebels, and vanquished, buried together with 400,000 Union soldiers, national heroes, all share the same cemetery. Unlike the rest of the cemetery, with headstones in straight rows, the Confederate section is arranged in concentric circles. Confederate tombstones are similar to Union headstones with a few distinct differences. Both share a similar size and material, although the Confederate tombstones are pointed at the top rather than rounded, unlike the ones you see in the rest of Arlington National Cemetery. Similar to other Civil War veterans' grave marks, the Confederates' names are etched with the military organization and the dates of birth and death, if known. The Confederate Southern Cross of Honor is noticeably inscribed on the top of the headstone instead of the usual religious symbol. If a couple is buried in a grave, the wife's name is inscribed on the back of the headstone. All the fronts of the headstones face the Confederate Memorial, which stand in the section's center. The monument is 32 feet high, with a statue of a woman that symbolizes the South at the top. Her head is crowned with olive leaves, and her left hand extends a laurel wreath toward the south, acknowledging the sacrifice of her fallen sons. Her right hand holds a pruning hook, resting on a plow stock. These symbols bring to life the biblical passage, "And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks." The plinth on which she stands is embossed with 4 cinerary urns, symbolizing the 4 years of the Civil War. A frieze of 14 inclined shields represents all 13 states of the Confederacy and includes Maryland, a state in which many of its citizens supported the Southern cause. Below the frieze is a cylindrical mount on which are 32 life-sized figures. In the front of the mount is the panoplied figure of Minerva. Minerva, goddess of war and wisdom, attempts to support the figure of a fallen woman. The woman is leaning against a shield emblazoned with the words, "The Constitution." Several vignettes illustrate the effect of the war on Southerners of all races. An officer turns to leave as his sweetheart clings to him for one last touch. A blacksmith leaves his forge while his wife looks into his eyes. An Episcopal priest and his wife send their teenage son off to war. There are several controversial figures. A soldier kisses his baby as she is held by a black mammy a household slave. A slave follows his master. The other sailors and soldiers represent all the branches of the Confederate Army and Navy. The front of the irregular octagonal base depicts the Great Seal of the Confederacy in low relief. In raised letters below the seal are the following words: "To our dead heroes, by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, victoris causa diis placuit sed victa caton." This Latin phrase means, "The victorious cause was pleasing to the gods, but the lost cause pleased Cato." It is a quotation from the poem Pharsalia by the ancient Roman poet Lucan. It refers to the attempt by the Roman senator Pompey to prevent Julius Caesar from becoming a dictator of Rome in 49 BC. Although he lost, Pompey's actions pleased the great honest philosopher Cato. On the north face of the memorial in raised letters are the following words: "Not for fame or reward, not for place or for rank, not lured by ambition or goaded by necessity, but in simple obedience to duty as they understood it. These men suffered all, sacrificed all, dared all, and died." Randolph Harrison McKim. McKim was a Confederate chaplain. Debates on the Confederate Memorial have been persisting for a long time. Some people think it is an icon of national reconciliation. Others think it is a pro-Southern textbook. But the monument is still widely regarded as the symbol of peace, reconciliation, reunion, and hope. The course of its construction actually demonstrates a microcosm of the history of national reconciliation. Before it was a cemetery, Arlington National Cemetery was Arlington House, the home of the Robert E. Lee families. When Lee was appointed to a brigadier general's rank in the Confederate Army in May 1861, the U.S. government took his land and home. In 1864, the federal government then turned this land into a cemetery for Union dead in the Civil War. The first graves in Arlington National Cemetery were dug by James Park, a former slave. The overwhelming number of military deaths in 1864 caused many Confederates to be buried at Arlington, not far from the graves of their former enemies. In 1865, Quartermaster General Montgomery C. Meigs decided to build a monument to the Civil War dead at Arlington. The bodies of 2,111 Union and Confederate dead buried within a 35-mile radius of the city of Washington, D.C., were collected. Most of them were fully or partially decomposed, and none were identifiable. Although Meigs had not intended to collect the remains of Confederate dead, the inability to identify remains meant that Union and Confederate dead were interred below the same cenotaph he built. The federal government did not permit the decoration of Confederate tombs at Arlington. In 1868, when Confederate families asked to lay flowers on the graves on Decoration Day, now known as Memorial Day, Meigs ordered that the families be barred from the cemetery. In 1869, members of some Union veteran groups stood watch over Confederate graves at Arlington National Cemetery to ensure they were not visibly honored on Decoration Day. The cemetery officials also refused to permit new Confederate burials. The 10-week Spanish-American War of 1898 marked the first time since the Civil War that Americans from South and North fought a common enemy. Numerous Confederate veterans volunteered their service and joined their Northern brothers on the battlefield. Joseph Wheeler, a noted cavalry general in the Confederate States Army, was appointed Major General of Volunteers. At the Atlanta Peace Jubilee on December 14, 1898, President William McKinley cited reconciliation between North and South in his speech that followed the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. He also announced that the federal government would now begin tending Confederate graves. Every soldier's grave during our unfortunate Civil War is a tribute to American valor, the President said. We should share with you in the care of the graves of the Confederate soldiers. The McKinley speech encouraged Southerners to seek additional improvements to the care and treatment of Confederate graves. Dr. Samuel E. Lewis, a former Confederate States Army surgeon, inventoried all Confederate graves at Arlington. He and other Confederate veterans sent a petition to President McKinley asking that the Confederate dead at Arlington and nearby be disinterred and reburied in a Confederate section. In 1900, Congress authorized an official Confederate section inside the Arlington National Cemetery. However, after June 1900, several Southern women's groups opposed allowing any Confederate dead to remain at Arlington. Most of the women's organizations argued that Confederate dead should lie in Southern soil. Confederate families should not rely on Union charity. To overcome this opposition, Lewis secured the endorsement of a plan by a number of former high-ranking Confederate officers and veterans societies. Lewis won the support of Hilary A. Herbert, a former colonel in the 8th Regiment Alabama Infantry who served in the United States House of Representatives from 1877 to 1893, and as Secretary of the Navy under President Grover Cleveland. Herbert pointed out that leaving the Confederate graves at Arlington made a greater impression on the public than isolating them in the pro-Confederate South. Lewis's tactics worked. After the process of informing families ended, reburial began in April 1901 and was completed the following October. Although the 1900 reburial legislation did not mention a memorial, War Department officials marked the central grassy area with an M, indicating that it was reserved for a memorial on the design map. This did not go unnoticed by Confederate groups. The United Daughters of Confederacy petitioned to erect a major monument to the Confederate dead. On March 4, 1906, Secretary of War William Howard Taft granted their request. Moses Ezekiel, a world-renowned sculptor and a Confederate veteran, was chosen to design the memorial. He felt that the monument was the most important commission he ever worked on, and he refused all other work so that he could devote all his time to it. The Confederate Memorial became his last and greatest work. Ezekiel did not ask for a design fee and was paid only his expenses. To one side of the monument lies the grave of Moses Ezekiel. On November 12, 1912, the cornerstone for the memorial was laid. That same evening, at a reception of the United Daughters of Confederacy, Mrs. Marion Butler, president of the District of Columbia Division of United Daughters of Confederacy, said, "We trust that the building of this monument will be the keystone of the arch of a reunited country." President William Howard Taft spoke at the reception. President Taft said, But no son of the South and no son of the North, with any spark in him of pride of race, can fail to rejoice in that common heritage of courage and glorious sacrifice that we have in the story of the Civil War and of both sides in the Civil War. The dedication ceremony for the Confederate Memorial was held on June 4, 1914. All members of Congress attended the ceremony. Mrs. Daisy McLaurin Stevens, President of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, presented the memorial to President Wilson as a gift to the American people. Veterans of both the Union and Confederacy placed wreaths on the graves of their former foes, symbolizing the reconciliation between the North and South, the memorial's central theme. The topic of a major address by President Wilson was closing a chapter. President Wilson said, "To declare this chapter in the history of the United States closed and ended, and I bid you turn with me, with your faces to the future, quickened by the memories of the past, but with nothing to do with the contests of the past, knowing, as we have shed our blood upon opposite sides, we now face and admire one another." The weather seemed to indicate the twists and turns on the road to reconciliation. An unexpected thunderstorm fast approached the cemetery as President Wilson neared the end of his remarks. President Wilson eventually cut his speech short, and the dedication ceremony ended abruptly. However, the unveiling ceremony was still considered a gesture for bringing together veterans and citizens from both sides of the Civil War to honor the sacrifices of their fellow Americans. Since the memorial's unveiling, the President of the United States has almost always sent a funeral wreath to be laid at the memorial every Memorial Day. Some presidents have declined to do so, and the tradition is controversial. As an African American, President Barack Obama faced a dilemma about continuing the tradition. In 2009, several dozen university professors and historians asked President Obama to end the tradition. President Obama himself never addressed the issue. Instead, Obama sent a wreath not only to the Confederate Memorial, but also to the African American Civil War Memorial in Washington, D.C. President Obama said, "Not far from here, appropriately just across a bridge connecting Lincoln to Lee, Union and Confederate soldiers share the same land in perpetuity." Debates on the Confederate Memorial will continue. The Confederate Memorial will still stand at Arlington National Cemetery in the future. It is the spirit of national reconciliation that has created the strength of the United States. Only reconciliation can make America great again.
This land is your land, this land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.